Welcome to Start Writing. I'm Joe Bondowski. Sorry for the late release on this episode. I was really sick on Friday and through the weekend, so I wasn't able to edit and go through and publish it. Today, we have an interview with the New York Times bestselling author Taylor Stevens. Her genre is thrillers and spy and information and deception kind of suspense thrillers. And her big hit was her first book, The Informationist. In the interview, we are going to talk about how she learned to write and how she's now teaching those tools to other writers. We will talk about how she was able to get a publisher and the techniques she used to really make sure that her query letter stood out and was effective. And she originally planned to send out 100, and by the time she'd sent out 20, she had multiple offers and multiple manuscript requests, all because of the investment she put into that query letter. And so she'll talk about that. Along with a lot of other things. She has a podcast as well, and in it she's very craft focused, and they go line by line through submissions from their audience. And so something we would recommend that you check out as well. But she has a lot of great information for writers, and is a very talented writer in her own right. And so very excited to have this interview. So this week in critiques, I came across this line as I was reading it. "It's not my fault. The child's voice was less than a whisper. Her ancient accent still prevalent even after 8 years in the new world. Not a whimper in her tone." Now, I know everybody has heard me talk about post-dialogue description over and over and over again. And this is post-dialogue description, but if you look at how much description we have after this line of dialogue, that simply front-loading it, I think, would be too much. There's too much detail in all that needs to happen here. So my thought on this is I would want to expand that single line of dialogue, and so that you could maybe take part of this description, move it to the very beginning of the paragraph so it precedes her first dialogue. Then you have a break, and we get more description of her tone and the accent and everything, and then we move into a second half of the dialogue, so that while the entire log doesn't get overloaded with description, we spread it out through spacing the dialogue. Now, the dialogue itself, it's not my fault. I don't think you'd want to break that. It's just too small in itself to break that up, which is why I would make it a slightly bigger dialogue to pack all of this description in. I would have her have another shorter statement later on. So again, I feel like I beat the dead horse on this, but I see so many authors doing this all the time. Even authors I know, fans of the podcast, still putting the description of dialogue after it. And I know why people do it. You will see it in almost any book you read. This is how it's done. But I always point to, we want to look at the reader's experience. And they cannot use those visual images and those guiding directions to read the dialogue the way it's intended in the scene if it comes after they've read the dialogue. So in our episode on this, where we go more in depth, we talk about if you're using descriptive tags like whisper and stuff, again, you need to initially talk about that before the dialogue. But when you've got a whole conversation being done in this style, you can use a quick tag like "she whispered," not so much as a description of the dialogue, but a reminder to the reader that this whole conversation is in whispered tones. So in those situations, instead of using "said" as a tag mostly to identify the speaker and help them track, you could use the whisper to remind them this is a type of conversation where they're speaking very quietly. So, yep, that is it for this week in critiques. I got a piece of fan mail that was talking about our episode on blurbs and blurb theory, and in it they were asking kind of, we'd gone through Jay Washburn's book Song of Locke. We'd rewritten his blurb 4 times on each of the 4 theories that we've explored, and so we're preparing for next week when I record with Jay. We will talk about his progress, which of them he's tried so far, and which have been the most successful for him. So you can look forward to that, and you can thank Chris for that email so we can kind of dive into that. And with that being said, here is the episode. All right, so this is my guest, New York Times bestselling author Taylor Stevens. So the way I found Taylor is I was listening to a different podcast, which is the Stephen Campbell's show, and he's kind of your co-host, isn't he?
He's absolutely my co-host. Without him, there would be no podcast for me.
So that's how I found your podcast. So why don't you tell us a little bit just about how you started writing, and then you're traditionally published, is that correct?
Yes.
And so tell us about why you started a podcast. So first, just tell us, how you got into writing, into publishing, and just the trajectory of your career there. And then tell us about why you started podcasting. Okay.
Well, I'm going to have to give the Cliff Notes here for that, because it's actually a really long story. Trying here with the Cliff Notes. I was born and raised in a religious cult. It was an environment that did not allow for education beyond 6th grade. It was very cloistered. We grew up in communes. It was global, so it had communes in up to 100 countries at any one time, and our worldview was very much framed by what we were told. We didn't leave without someone accompanying us into the outside world, and it was usually for begging, because the cult didn't believe in gainful employment. It believed the world was going to end any day. So that's why education was seen as a waste of time for the children. And they generally put the children out on the streets to beg, because people were more inclined to give money to kids than to able-bodied adults. So that was the background that I came from. And it was a world in which creative writing was not even seen as, like, forget career opportunity or something you did when you grew up. It was seen as the devil's mind, so to speak. And growing up there, I'm probably one of the first 200 kids that were born into this movement. And so I sort of hit all the experiments up the ladder or down the ladder. And during the many phases that the cult went through, there was a time when my family was living in the United States, and compulsory education laws required that I attend a real school. So that's where my 6th grade education came from, and that's where I learned to love to read. And I would escape into the libraries any opportunity I got. And I probably read through most of the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew series. And that was what I knew fiction to be. And so a little bit later, when I was about 13, I was in an environment that was incredibly boring, and I sort of became a de facto storyteller. We were child laborers, cooking, cleaning. It was boring, doing that for 100 people at a time, and sometimes, 30 people, but whatever. And so I sort of became de facto entertainment by telling stories to the other commune children. And eventually I started writing those down. And eventually they got discovered, and I got in really big trouble. They called me a witch and had to have an exorcism, and they took my fledgling little novels and burned them and told me don't ever write fiction again. And that was that. When I was finally free and out, I was in my late 20s, and I had 2 kids. I was married to a man that I had met my age in the cult. And we left together, and the babies were very young. And it was a situation of, well, who's going to go to work and who's going to stay with the kids? Because neither one of us had any education, any career opportunities, any resumes. We didn't have credit history. We didn't have a social support. We didn't have anything that most people sort of take for granted in, Western life when you leave home. So he ended up going to work, and I stayed home with the kids. And I just have one of those minds that is constantly looking for things to do. And at first, when we left, we didn't have, I was just grappling for some sense of how do you survive in the world. And we were so broke that I would go to garage sales on the weekend to buy things that I could turn around and resell on eBay. Just small stuff, but, when you're so poor, every dollar adds up. And one of the things that I found out had a really high resale value compared to how much you paid for them was books. So you could buy a box of books for maybe, $2 or $3 and turn around and parcel them out depending on what was in there and, make that twice over or 3 times over. And when I was doing that, I started to read like all the business books and stuff, burned myself out on them and couldn't pick up another one. And so I started peeking at the fiction that I would buy. And up to that point, I'd probably maybe read, 20 or so grown-up novels, not the Nancy Drew Hardy Boy books from my childhood. And so most of us, when we go to a library or a bookstore, we kind of have a sense of authors that we like because we're familiar with them. And I didn't know anything. Like, none of these names made any sense to me. And I didn't have a lot of time to just sit around reading. And one day I saw this book by Robert Ludlum that was in a box, didn't have a cover on it. I didn't know who he was, but I recognized the title of the book because there'd been a movie way before that I'd wanted to see and wasn't allowed to. So I picked it up and I read it, and it blew my mind. I had never in my life thought it was possible for somebody to write such complexity. And the book was the Holcroft Covenant. So at that point, anytime I would stumble upon a Robert Ludlum book, well, I knew the name now. And so I would pick it up, and that's how I discovered Jason Bourne. And I totally and completely fell in love with Jason Bourne. And this was before Matt Damon and the eye candy and all of that. This was just on the page. I fell in love with his character so hard that I went to Half Price Books and forked over the enormous sum of like $6 or $7 to buy a used copy of the next book in the series. And it was when in reading one of those books, just completely immersed in this story and in the characters, I had this moment of, I wish that I could make other people feel the way that I feel when I'm reading. And then I was like, wait a minute. I've lived further off the map than any of the places Robert Ludlum is writing about in his books. And I wanted to write when I was growing up, and nobody would let me. And I don't know what I'm going to do with my life. No matter what I do, it's going to be hard. It's going to take forever. I don't want to go to my grave with regrets saying, well, I wish I would have taken the time. I'm home alone with my kids. I'm going to write a book. And that's what started me on my path.
Wow. That's an intense story. So, okay. So you start writing books. I'm going to come back around to your publishing because there's a few things I heard you mention in the podcast that have me curious. But for right now, so you've started a podcast. Talk to me about why that is. It seems like almost every podcast on writing, with rare exception, is usually done by indie authors because that's part of how we build platform. So tell me why you started podcasting.
Well, as you know, Stephen Campbell is my co-host. He and I are long-distance friends. We met when The Informationist, which is my first book, shortly after it had published. And Steve at that time was doing a number of other shows and podcasts, and he asked me if I would be a guest. And I was like, yeah, absolutely. And it was one of the best interviews that I'd ever had because he asks such intelligent questions. And after the interview was over, we still kept on talking for like another half an hour or so. And our friendship kind of just blossomed from there. So when I was on book 5, which is The Mask, and it was getting ready to publish, Steve said to me, well, have you thought about doing a podcast? Maybe you can do one to help promote this book that's coming with, details about the research and all the insider stuff that I think fans would really love to know about. And I was like, sure. I was thinking in my mind, he was going to interview me for one of his shows or something. And he's like, no, I mean, like, do your own podcast. And I was like, come on, you know me. And if I have to figure anything out, it's never going to happen. I don't have the time to sit here and do this. And he's like, well, I already know how to do all this. I'll do the production for you and everything. And I was like, well, could we do it how we do it on your shows where you just ask me questions? And he's like, if that's what you want. And I was like, yes, that's what I want. And that's how the show started. And it just kept going. It started off just to talk about the inside stuff of books, and it morphed into about the writing life. And now we go hardcore into teaching other authors how to do what I do because I came at it backwards. And like most of my audience, they don't have experience with publishing. they're sort of trying to teach themselves as they go. And that's what I did. And that's sort of what we do now.
Yeah, so I guess I haven't heard the very first episodes. I've started at the end and I'm working backwards through it, but it seems like the hardcore line editing, I think there's probably maybe 5 or 6 episodes that way, maybe even fewer than that. And then the rest seemed more like just more standard podcasts. Is that correct?
We take listener questions. So when the audience, if anyone in the audience has a problem that they're struggling with in their own writing, and sometimes it's Steve because he's writing too, he has an issue in his own writing, we'll use that as a topic of discussion. So we ramble a lot, but we try to focus in on a specific issue that someone is having.
So, okay. And so how did the line editing come about? It seems like a newer evolution. And I guess as far as podcasting goes, like that's not one that I listen to on the treadmill. I'm like, you have to watch the video to really get what she's doing here. And it's almost more like a masterclass than a podcast, those episodes.
Those episodes will eventually become part of this program that I've been talking about it for years. It's called Hack the Craft, which basically takes all the tips and tricks I learned, basically writing hacks to shortcut the years of reading and writing I never got. And so those are sort of demonstrations of how I'm applying what will be broken down into specific hacks eventually when I ever have a time to put it all together. So they sort of serve a dual purpose. And it started because someone asked me to take a look at a piece of their material and see if I could get it cleaned up for them. And we decided to do it for the podcast. And Steve, on a whim, said, let's record video and see if we can make it work that way. And so we did. And we got so much feedback from it. And it was so appreciated. They're like, we should probably do more of this. So we put out offers to our audience pretty regularly saying, if you've got material that you're unsure about and you want me to show you how to make it better, then we'll do it on air.
So yeah, they're great episodes. Like I definitely recommend them to everyone, but it's not an episode you're going to listen to on the treadmill. You really do need to see the video. Like there's a PDF download where you can see her corrections, and then in the video she goes very much line by line.
I try to make it easy for someone who's only listening, but writing is such a visual project that a lot gets missed if you're only listening to it. Yeah. So I definitely recommend the videos for sure. And the videos, those are your Patreon page, right? Like the episodes link to the videos, but I think they're only available on the Patreon page. Yes. Anything that we record on the podcast, when I edit the videos, I try and keep the videos shorter. We cut out all the talking and things like that. They go on my Patreon page, but they're made public. So you don't have to have a Patreon account to see them. And then I offer other stuff for those who would be willing to pledge to keep the tutorials coming, because it takes a lot of work, a lot of time to go into this. And I do it as a gift to my listeners and to try and help those who are struggling the way that I struggled. Like, look, guys, this is what I figured out. This is how you do it. Because I'm the type of person that somebody can tell me till they're blue in the face the theory of something, but until I actually see it done, I don't really get it. And once I see it, it clicks, and I'm like, okay. So for those who are like me, that's why I'm putting it out there. And then the Patreon page is available for those who feel that it's providing value to their lives and would like to keep more of it coming. And it's basically paying for the time.
Yeah, well, they definitely look like they take a lot. I mean, you are writing more than is actually written in the book in all your comments and editing. Like, it's intense.
I try to make it worth people's time.
So they are great episodes. I highly recommend them for anyone. I don't know if you're familiar with Tim Grahl, if that name sounds familiar to you or not.
I'm so bad with names, but if you tell me what he did, it might.
So it started out where he ran a consulting firm that would help with launching books. And he's very well known in the indie world about teaching indie authors how to grow their mailing list and whatnot. So he met with, I believe, the editor's name is Simon Cowell. Maybe I'm getting that wrong. No, Simon Coyne. And they started a podcast that was a project where Tim would write and then he would discuss it with.
Is that the Story Grid?
So Simon Coyne is the author of the Story Grid. Yes. And maybe that's the name of the podcast too. I don't remember. But so the idea is that Tim would write and then he would go through episode by episode with Sean and they would take it, apply the Story Grid, really break it down and look at it. And I was really excited, and I know a lot of the other authors that are in my social circle, we were all very excited to see this show launch. And I think within 6 or 7 episodes, all of us had stopped listening. We were like, it just, they ramble too much. It's not condensed enough. The episodes are like an hour long, and maybe you get one tidbit, but it just wasn't very focused. And then I came across your line editing, and I started telling my friends about like, this is what we thought the Story Grid would be. She's going line by line. She's taking these things. She explains in great detail every change she recommends. She knows what she's doing. She's a best-selling author. So yeah, so these episodes are what I was hoping the Story Grid would be.
You bring up it's an interesting thing because it's really easy to confuse story and writing, right? And what I'm focusing on, even though story and writing are sort of entwined, I'm focusing on the writing, and I haven't listened to any of the podcasts from the Story Grid. I used to read some of the emails, so I'm a little bit familiar with it, but it deals with story, right? The big, huge, overreaching arc. And so we don't really touch that on this podcast. We're focusing on the nitty-gritty, how to make your immediate scenes sort of explode with detail and description, like how to guide description and get the reader immersed into the scene. And the one we just actually finished working on one about using movement, using character movement to guide the story and entwine detail so that it doesn't come across as dry or info dumping. So that's the type of stuff we're working on rather than big picture storytelling.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Although I think within that, because they were going chapter by chapter, they weren't like taking a look at the big story outline. They weren't looking outlines. So even though I think initially maybe it looked like they were going to be doing that, and maybe they did eventually, they were kind of doing what you were doing. It was just less focused, and there wasn't a video or a document that you could look at and see if Sean had marked it up in those changes. And so, what I saw was yours was very tight and efficient and effective. And theirs had just been a little bit too loose to make it worth my time, I think.
Well, this is where I take a bow and I say thank you very much.
Yeah. So I thought it was great. And that's, like I said, I've recommended it to all my writing friends, and definitely recommending it here on the show as well. So you've mentioned that you take submissions and you work through them. I wonder if you're ever planning to maybe take some of your own work and say, this is my first draft. These are some of my choices, and in my revision, these are some of the changes I've made.
I've thought about that, but I find that when I'm working my own stuff, I make so many revisions along the way that I can't keep track of them. And the other thing, too, is it's a little bit like how you don't want to be your own lawyer or your own doctor, or doctors shouldn't perform plastic surgery on their spouses, that type of concept. I find that when I'm not working on my own material, it's easier for me to come at something with fresh eyes and not choke with perfection. Like, I'm not trying to make it perfect. I'm trying to show sort of a starting point to take people in a direction. Whereas if I'm working on my own stuff, because I'm such a perfectionist, I would choke. I wouldn't ever finish it because I would be like, well, I can't put this out there until it's perfect, and it's never going to be perfect. So I just felt that it was more conducive to getting it done to work with other people's material.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Yeah. So awesome. Okay. So I actually should have done this earlier. Why don't you talk a little bit about what you write and why you write the kind of novels that you do?
All right. Well, I'm between series at the moment, but no matter what I write up to this point, I describe them as high-octane character studies. They fall under the thriller genre, but thrillers in general tend to be very plot-heavy, and I write character-driven stories that just happen to be thrillers. So they kind of don't entirely fit the they're the round peg in the square hole, or either way. And so they're thrillers. They're boots on the ground, international thrillers for the most part. The first series is with a character who's a female mercenary information hunter. And she's somewhat fashioned after Jason Bourne. I mean, I was reading Jason Bourne when I made the decision to write. She's got that sense of, that damage to her in the way that Jason Bourne did. And she's very world weary and heavily traveled. And it's a series that follows her through all of the crap that she gets into. And the second is a little bit lighter, not quite as dark, but also fast, incredibly just punchy and twisty and espionage related. And I can't say too much because it's still in progress.
Okay. So I checked out a couple of your books. In our emailing back and forth, the Informationist you mentioned is your first novel, but you had also said that it's not my best work, particularly because it's your first. However, you had said that it's the novel that I learned to write by writing it.
Yes.
So I checked out The Informationist, but I do think there's an odd kind of almost a paradox in the writing world, is that we get better at writing the more we write, but most readers want to start at the beginning, which is the book that probably represents our least effective storytelling.
Well, actually, that's really interesting, because The Informationist may possibly be the best story I'll ever write, but the writing itself in it, I've improved on.
Interesting.
So
okay.
In that sense, it's great storytelling, which is probably why it did so well. But I've learned to write better since then. And as I teach and do these tutorials, if I go back and glance at my earlier work, I'm kind of like, palm to my head going, all the things I told you not to do, I did in that book. But, I learned to writing that book. So
okay. So one of the things that I thought was really interesting, and I believe the other book of yours that I was looking at is The Catch.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. And so as I read the opening of The Informationist, the opening, I guess it's prologue, reads very much like any thriller opening would. We have this really action-packed, tight, short scene, and to kind of launch us into the story. But in The Catch, the opening scene is just a conversation on a rooftop. And, we don't have this really intense hook or this fast-paced action, but it is, as you mentioned, it's very character intense, this moment on this rooftop. And while we don't get a lot of her actual history, we do get a lot of her internal processes going on. So I thought I'd just ask you, why you chose to approach this book different. You developed your writing skills more. You understand more about the craft, and in this later book, you've made this choice. Why is that?
Well, there's a couple of reasons. The first is that we're now 4.5 into the series. There's a half book in between the third and The Catch is the fourth. So a lot has happened already. And the characters, when I write the characters, they're real people. They're not, the characters form the plot, so to speak. And I needed to start the story where the story started. And so that's why it started there, that's where all the backstory, everything that happened in between the two books, it could come out later in the story as it progressed. But where that particular story started was right there on the rooftop. And so we go. And the thing about characters, just like we do in real life, is they get affected by the things that have happened to them. And The Catch opens with the main character. She is depressed. She's shut off from life. She does not care whether she lives or dies. And she's just there to try and keep herself alive for whatever. And so it starts in that frame of mind, and we go from there.
Okay, so I guess you did mention this is a series. I heard Brandon Sanderson speaking once about his Way of King series, and it was actually the opening book of the series, and he said, yes, it starts very slow. He says, but I have a large enough readership who trust me as a storyteller that I knew I could get away with it. And he says, if you're writing your first novel, I don't recommend it. So,
well, I would agree with him on that. And an interesting thing about The Catch is it's probably my best writing, period, in terms of accuracy and literacy. And it is also equally my least appreciated book.
Isn't that funny how that happens?
So that was my learning point, where after that, I realized the writing doesn't really matter. It matters to a point. I teach that every reader has sort of a reading river with a lower bank and an upper bank. And the water flowing through that river has to pass the genre dam. So if it's not in that reader's genre, it's not going into that river. But once it's in that river, they have a lower level and upper level that they won't read below as far as quality, and they won't read above because causes them to have to think too much. And some readers have very wide rivers, and some readers have very narrow rivers. And as the author, your goal is not to stretch that outer bank. It's to get right in that sweet spot where as many readers will read it as possible. And with The Catch, I kind of pushed the envelope and went too high, upper bank. And that's when I realized the writing is not important as the story. Story matters more.
That's an interesting. I like your analogy there, but that is an interesting point there, that you had done your best writing, and in so doing, it kind of shut out some of your standard readers.
Yeah, hard lesson to learn, but
yeah, that is a hard lesson. So this is, I wanted to cover one of the points that you talked about in one of these editing tutorials, just to kind of showcase what's in them and just how deep it is. And so in one of these tutorials, you had mentioned psychological and emotional anchors. And the line you had been reading before was "pain pierced her shoulder as," and then you started to talk about how you didn't feel like there were strong enough psychological and emotional anchors. And so I hope I've given you enough information here to talk about it. If not, we can just cut this section.
Okay. Well, anchoring is a term, it's hard to explain, but the Hack the Craft program that I mentioned earlier, which is based on all the tips, tricks, hacks, it essentially has 3 concepts that is the foundation of everything. And some of these concepts take a bit to explain, to actually have a tutorial that explains that. That's on the higher level of the Patreon page, where all the pre-Hack the Craft stuff goes for those who want to get it before 5 years down the road, whenever the program is actually put together. But anchoring is the second leg of the 3 primary things. And anchoring is essentially never letting your hands leave the reader. The reader never loses their place in the story. And there are multiple types of anchors. You have emotional anchors, psychological anchors, but it's keeping the reader solidly in time, place, and space inside the story. And what happens when scenes within scenes, like the beats within a scene, are not properly anchored, is the reader has a tendency to loose, sort of like a helium balloon that isn't anchored to the ground. They float away from the story because they're not grounded in where they are and what's going on and why the character is doing what they do. So you can intensify the scene and you can keep the reader right there with you, feeling everything, by making sure that each point is anchored as you go.
I think I've got an idea of what you're saying here from that. And I've seen the video, so I don't know how clear that's going to be to the listeners here, but I think I have an idea of what you mean with those anchors. What are the other 2 legs? Just you don't need to explain them fully. Just can you give me like their titles?
The first one is perspective, which a cheat sheet way of explaining it is writing movie style or writing first-person shooter style. And movie style is when the author is trying to explain to the reader everything that they see. And that is a very faulty way of conveying emotion to the reader. And all reading, it has to be an alive emotional experience for the reader to stay engaged with the characters and engaged with the plot. And by describing things as you see them, like you would in a movie, you only give the reading mind half of the information that it needs. But when you write your scenes as if your character, you are a first-person shooter and seeing through your character's eyes, it creates a different sense of timing, a different sense of place, and the reader then becomes the character and they're able to fully immerse themselves in the story. So there's a much longer explanation of that on my Patreon page. There's a much longer explanation of anchoring on my Patreon page. And eventually I start building out explanations and show you exactly why and how it's done. The third leg is flow. And that's where anchoring is where the author lets the reader, through not crafting the sentences properly, not anchoring, they let the reader lose sense of where they are in the story. Flow is when the author has something in their head that applies to a scene or a character that never actually makes it to the page. So the author has lost their place in the story. So almost every writing trick or hack boils down to perspective, anchoring, or flow.
You've convinced me. I'm going to have to check all these out. I'm going to have to sign up and watch some of this stuff that's beyond what's free. This is really interesting stuff.
And eventually I do hope to build it all out into a much larger sustainable program that people can take at their own pace and study online. Yeah. And just based on I've read a lot of writing books and they all go over my head. They talk about these theoretical issues like theme and, it goes so deep, character archetypes. And I'm just like, it doesn't make any sense to me. I'm so literal and so practical and hands-on. So I want to give people a way to understand this from a real pedestrian point that completely elevates your writing without all the headiness.
Yeah. Okay. So have you written a book on writing or?
No, that's the program. It's a program that I'm working. I've been talking about it for years, but my own writing has to take priority and, life. So it's been a work in progress.
Okay. So as opposed to writing a book on writing, it will be more of a visual program, a series of videos and whatnot that you can watch.
Yes, and it will incorporate a lot of the tutorials the tutorials will be a lot of bonus material, or it will be like, if you want an example of anchoring, this tutorial will give you an in-depth, line editing example.
So I think that'll definitely be a lot more effective than a book, actually, because you can see you go through it step by step. I think that'll be great.
Exactly.
So, okay. Where's my next question? Okay, so talk to me about The Informationist and learning to write. What happened there? What was the process where you're like, I need to improve my writing and these are the changes I made? And just talk to me about that transformation.
Well, when I started, I was a stay-at-home mom with 2 toddlers. And as any mother knows, when you have toddlers, you don't really get a lot of break to just sit and write. So I was writing in between the moments. And when I first started, I was smart enough to know that I didn't know anything. And so at that time, Barnes & Noble had this thing called BNN University, where you could sign up for an online course, non-credited, it was free. And they had a creative writing course. So I was like, okay, well, I don't know anything, so I'm going to sign up for this thing. And they had 2 books that they wanted you to get. One was The Great Gatsby, and one was the Gotham Writers Workshop, which is from the Iowa's Writers MFA course or something along those lines. And then I went and bought them, spent real money for it, didn't get them in a garage sale. And so, was signed up, and the teacher introduced herself online, and different people started introducing themselves. And she's like, this is going to be your first little assignment. And I was like, oh no. I realized right then and there what was going to happen was that I was going to be writing things I didn't care about to please people I didn't know, and that it was going to be critiqued by people who had no idea of what my own long-term goals were. And having grown up in an environment where I could never be good enough no matter how hard I tried, I knew that if I did this, I would never write. And so I was like, well, up to this point, I've taught myself everything I know by reading. I'm just going to read these books. So I read The Great Gatsby, which I totally didn't get and still don't. And I read the Gotham Writers Workshop cover to cover, and I kind of sort of quasi got it. And as I read it, I just started writing. I didn't have a character. I didn't have a plot. I didn't have anything except a place that I wanted to write about. The Informationist takes place in Equatorial Guinea, which is an island off the coast of West Africa. Well, it's half a country. Half the country is the island. And I had lived there. And it's so remote. And at that time, very few Americans, there were Spaniards and French, very few of them, but very few Americans went there who were not part of the oil industry. And the oil industry was still new there at the time. And I wanted to show the world this paranoid, cult-like country that I had been living in. And so that was the basis that I had to work with. And I had to develop characters. I had to sort of develop plot. I didn't know how to write. And I just wrote every single day in the minutes that I had. And when I was exercising, which was usually bouncing on a little trampoline while my kids were watching a movie, I would be thinking about these characters that I was writing. And I would write and realize that was sucked. And I would keep writing. And by the time I was halfway through this story that was developed, it was very organic. I didn't plot. I didn't know anything about plotting. I didn't even know anything about genre. And so I was just writing what I had been reading, which was Robert Ludlum was exciting, so I'm going to write an exciting book.
Wow.
Which is how I sort of fell into the thriller market. And so as I started getting better and I'd go back and I would read what I had written before, I was like, oh, no, this is not good. And I would rewrite it. And to that end, the earliest chapters, like the prologue and the first chapter of the book, was some of the last that I ever wrote, because by the time I got to the end, I went back and said, this sucks. I've got to do it all over again. And so the writing is sort of like a wave in the sense of it gets good and then it gets lower and then it gets good and then it gets lower, because my writing progressed, my skill progressed. And the more my skill progressed, the more I could see how awful what I had done before was. I had to keep going back and redoing it until I finally got the whole thing sort of the same standard where it was like, okay, this is as good as I can get it for now. But even then, I didn't have a true sense of how stories worked in terms of plot and pacing and backflashes and all of that. So when I got an agent, she pointed out a few things to me and she says, I can see some issues here, how this grinds the story to the halt, and what I would recommend doing is XYZ. Why don't you go take some time with it and see what you can do? And that's all that I had needed at that point, was somebody to guide me and say, well, you did the writing okay, that's great, but here's how story works now.
So that's how the whole process rolled out. That's interesting. So you became a thriller writer just because you were reading thrillers.
That's pretty much how it happened. If I'd been reading romance novels, who knows where we'd be right now? Which I must say, romance novels are really hard to write. I am not bashing on romance writers.
So what do you think makes the romance so hard to write comparatively?
Well, where a thriller is plot specific, romance is entirely about emotion. And if you can't engage your reader's emotions in the romance, you have nothing. And so you have to work a lot harder to get there's nothing but the romance practice. I mean, there's a plot, obviously. And some of them are a little steamier than others. And I will say that I am by no means a prude, but I am too smart to try and write a good sex scene, because that's hard to do. That is really hard to do. And kudos and hats off to those who can pull that off. So
these are questions we usually kind of throw out everybody we talk to. But so what do you consider the strongest part of your writing, and how did you develop that?
My strongest part is the immersion, the vividness of it, that when readers read what I write, they are there. They are completely there. Assuming they like the story. I mean, there's nothing that any person can write that will please everybody. But assuming they are my type of readers, then they are not going to get lost by not understanding what's going on. The scenes are vivid, where you can taste and smell and feel them.
And then what is, I guess, one of your pet peeves as a reader? Like you see it in a book and you set it down and be like, not for me. I can't handle it if the writer's going to be doing that.
It takes a lot for me to refuse to read a book because of writing. So I can't say I've ever put a book down and refused to read it because of a pet peeve in terms of writing, but there are some story issues that I won't, as strange as it seems, because I write violent books, I cannot read violence in others' work. I'm very sensitive to violence, and anything that has gratuitous violence, I'm out. And especially if it involves children or animals, I'm done.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, that's very interesting considering where what kind of springboarded you was Robert Ludlum. I guess I have one of his books, but I haven't read him. I saw the movies, and that's the closest I've ever come to his work. But I assume there'd be a fair amount of violence in them.
You know, I honestly don't remember so much as the suspense, but I will tell you, and I warn a lot of people who say, oh, I want to start writing, or I'm, taking my writing seriously now. And they're avid readers when they start doing that. And I warn them, it's going to ruin the reading experience for you. Because before you start writing, all you do is just read it.
Yep.
You don't have anything to base it on. You just sort of know that you prefer this type of writer over that type of writer. This person's a better writer, but you don't understand the mechanics of it. And once you start understanding the mechanics of it, you have a really hard time reading poorly written books. And Robert Ludlum was a master storyteller, but he was an awful writer.
Oh.
I did not know that when I was reading his books because I wasn't a writer. And neither were the 150 million people who bought his books and made him a mega, mega international bestseller. But if you are a writer and if words really matter to you and you go back and read them, you're going to be scratching your heads going, how could this have been the book that made her start writing?
That's funny. Yeah. For me, when I started writing very seriously, it did ruin a lot of authors for me. I couldn't read their work anymore, but I found that if I enjoyed them as storytellers, I could still do it in audio and it didn't bother me as much.
Exactly.
So like Dan Brown, I always enjoy his work, but I cannot read him anymore. But I can listen to him in audio and I don't get frustrated.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm talking about.
So yeah, that definitely does happen. So in one of your episodes, I heard you mention that you had an easier time publishing than a lot of people. And I wonder if you could maybe talk to us about what happened that either you have that perspective or just, what was it that you felt that kind of made your career launch easier than some of the other authors that you've heard about or wherever that comparison's coming from?
There's a lot of luck in this industry. And, luck favors the prepared, obviously. I never could have gotten published the way that I had if I hadn't already done so much of the legwork and, gotten myself to that point. So I'm not discounting hard work at all. When I went to find an agent, I was prepared for a lot of rejection. And I told myself, okay, I'm going to make it a goal that I need 100 rejections. That's my goal. So that even when I'm rejected and it sucks so bad, I can at least cross it off my list and say, yay, I got another one closer to 100. But I never got past 20 because by the time I had sent out 20, I already had 2 agents offering representation and a handful of others asking for full manuscripts and whatnot.
Oh, great.
A lot of authors don't have that happen to them. I don't know why exactly it happened to me that way, except that I did my research. I heavily did my research before I started querying, and I probably worked harder on that query letter than I ever did on a similar set of words in my own book. But also, I think I understood the psychology of querying, which is the person on the other line has something that I need, and they're used to talking to crazy people. And my goal here is to make them understand that I'm not crazy that I have something of value, and here's why they should read it.
They're used to talking to crazy people. That's funny.
When you realize that they get like thousands of emails from people, just some of the submissions are just really bizarre. You can go to Slush Pile Hell. I'm not sure if that Tumblr still exists, but it shows some of the insanity that passes through their inbox. And my goal was to not be that.
Yeah, I don't know if I went to that site exactly, or there was another site, and it was just an agent posting some of the ridiculous stuff they got. And they really do get some really just wild and ridiculous stuff across their desks.
Yes, exactly. So that was that part. And, I had some bumps in the road along the way in that right when my agent was ready to start submitting, the economy tanked. The Great Recession that we just went through. And so she pulled it off the market and told me to sit tight on it. She said, you only get one shot at a debut. And at this rate, you risk it being rejected just because of the situation, or you risk it getting bought and then the editor's not there the next month and it gets completely abandoned. She sat on it for almost a year before taking it out. And then once it did get snapped up, not only did I lose my editor, I lost my publisher. And they got absorbed into a larger part of the conglomerate. And I survived it because there were already so many people in that branch that were big fans of the book. So the publicity team was already on board, the marketing team was already on board, and there were other editors who were still there who really wanted to take it on. So I survived that. But so even though I had a really good start into publishing, it doesn't mean that it has been smooth sailing since, because I've experienced what a lot of authors experience in traditional publishing, where I went through one editor each book. Each book started a new editor. There wasn't a lot of consistency running through it. And eventually the series got abandoned. And unfortunately, in traditional publishing, you're only as good as your last book. And it doesn't matter the circumstances it doesn't matter if your book was scheduled to drop on the day after September 11th. If your book bombed, somehow that was your fault, right? Yeah. So it's a very capricious industry, and I have found myself having to completely reinvent myself all over again in the industry. And so it's not something for the faint of heart, and I always advise those who are looking to get into it that you think that getting your book published is sort of the end of the line, like that's what you're trying to achieve. Sorry to break it to you, that's where you get started. And it's all uphill after that. So it's one of those things you have to really know this is what you want. For me, I don't really have a choice. I have no plan B. I'm useless for anything else. I've never worked another job. My skills do not translate well into the real world. So I'm like, this is do or die. I have got to figure this out. And so I'm charting my own path all over again.
Wow. Okay. And then, I guess in that explanation, I kind of have the answer to my other question, but I'm going to go ahead and throw it at you anyway. So you were launching this book. You met with Stephen Campbell a few times on his show, and he had talked you into starting podcasts as a way to kind of push this new book that was coming out. So the book launches. Yeah. Book launches, you do several podcasts on it. Why did the podcast continue? What made you decide, be like, I'm going to just keep doing this?
We were having fun. There's no other way to put it. When you're writing and that's all you do, I'm fortunate, and I'm not begrudging this at all, that I get to write full time. That's what I do. I don't have a day job. My kids are growing, so I get a lot of hate at home from teenagers. And when you're writing and that's all you do, you have to go a long, long time before you get your wins. Unlike other aspects of life, you have constant little mountains that you're climbing and planting your flag on, and you move on to something else. And it can be very lonely and depressing at times, because you wait so long for those very short victories in as a published author. And doing the podcast allowed me to focus my energy into teaching. And teaching is so much more fun than writing. It is so much more fun to talk about it than it is to do it. So it gives me an opportunity to find an outlet with small wins along the way. And then that allows my creativity to flourish for the long haul.
Awesome. Okay. Well, that is everything I had. Is there anything, I guess, you wanted to share as you thought about this, or anything you'd really want to tell the people before we wrap up this interview?
Well, I would just say that I know that your audience are writers. And I've been teaching everything that I've learned for a long time now. And if you want to get it by email, I have a mailing list that I email out everything I've learned along the way of overcoming adversity and into publishing. The podcast has been going on for 2+ years. And the Patreon page is a launch pad for the Hack the Craft program. So if anything of these interest you and you want more, my website is www.taylorstevensbooks.com. You have to put the books in there because there's another Taylor Stevens far more famous than me for much different reasons.
Really?
Not safe for work reasons.
Taylor Stevens, like I typed that into Google and you were like you were like the first 4 links that came up. Maybe I've got a filter on that's
or maybe you have really good safe browsing habits.
But yeah, like you were the top 4 and I didn't scroll down because you were the one I was looking for.
Yeah, that's awesome. So TaylorStevensBooks.com, there's a connect with me button on there that will lead you to the sign up page to my mailing list. The podcast can also be accessed through that website. It has its own page as well, which is TaylorStevensShow.com. And my Patreon page, which has so many more tutorials in which I do try and update regularly. I want to give value. That is always my goal, is to provide value. And that is www.patreon.com/Taylor Stevens.
All right. Anywhere else that they can look you up? I mean, you're on Amazon, right? Of course.
Yes. I mean, the books are wherever books are sold type things, although it's harder and harder to find them in bookstores now because it's been a few years since the last one published. But online, they're pretty easy to find.
So anywhere else they can connect with you, Twitter or Facebook, or is it mostly just to the website?
Well, I am on Twitter at Taylor Stevens, and on Facebook, facebook.com Taylor Stevens. But I'm not real prolific on social media. I'll respond when people interact with me, but I find that it takes too much brain power to try and come up with witty things to post
every day.
Like you're screaming into the void anyway. And I'd much rather have a personal connection with people. There is a Facebook fan club group. If you search Taylor Stevens Author Fan Club in groups on Facebook, it should take you there. And I will show up there and interact more. And I'll post stuff in there that I don't really want to put out, like pictures and stuff. I don't really want to put out to the world, you know?
Mm-hmm.
But really, email and those other avenues are the best way to get in contact with me.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for your time. This was great.
Thank you for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
Thanks for listening. As always, we would love it if you would leave a review or tell a friend about the podcast. If you want links to the books and the authors we talk about, or to see the blog posts that detail the craft and the grammar and marketing discussions, you can sign up for the newsletter and we'll send those there. When we talk about video clips and different things like that within the episode, we will always put links to those in that newsletter as well. So if you're interested in those things, you can sign up and we'll send you that. I only send one email a month, and it is after the month is over, and so it's just kind of a recap with all the extra details from the previous month there. And always, if you enjoy the show, we would love it if you would check out one of our books. And that's the end of our episode, so it's time to start writing.